Hashem, we are learning PESACHIM Daf Ayin Hey. We are continuing to learn how the Koren Pesach is roasted when it's brought on the Mizbeach. We're going to be going back a bit to a sugya that we had on Daf Chavav Amid Beis, and that was when an oven was warmed up, was fired up with something that the Torah does not allow us to have hana'ah from. Like, for example, if you heat up an oven, you fire up an oven with klipe orla. If you remember, we had the shita of Rabbi that shvach eitzim bapas. We're going to see how this will relate to our sugya of the importance of preparing the Koren Pesach, dafke, specifically tzli eish, fire roasted. And we're going to learn shitas Rabbi that coals that are only flickering. If you remember, there's coals that are even less than flickering. There are coals that are called smoldering. Gechalim, oimemois. There's mamish no fire there. But then you have coals that, even though the fire is not coming out, but there's still some remnant of fire in it. It's called gechalim loy chashois. And Rebbe's opinion is that gechalim ikre eish. We'll see how this relates to the preparation of Koren Pesach. We're going to have a lot of pushback against Shitas Rebbe, but Rebbe ultimately will prevail that indeed that coals are considered fire, even if the coals are, so to say, only flickering. Now, because of that, we're going to also go and learn a difference between wood coals versus metal coals. Don't forget that wood coals at a point in the beginning were mamish on fire. Masha'enkein metal becomes red hot, but it never, so to say, there's never fire. It never becomes fire, and that will make a difference. We're going to go a little bit into the sugya that we have in Sanhedrin regarding one of the Arba Misas Bezdin, which is Mitzas Sreifa. We're going to have a very unusual application of V'ahavta l'reyacha kamoicha, etc. And on Daf Ayin Hey Amid Beis, we're going to start another foundational, fundamental sugya when it comes to Hilchas Kashrus, and that is the sugya of Ilah Gavar versus Tata'a Gavar. When there is a potential mixing of flavors, of ta'am, from something that's prohibited in something that's permitted, when do we say that there was such a mingling of flavors? And even if the flavor of one went into the other, how much does it penetrate? We're going to learn about the halach of kedei klipa. Sometimes you have to peel off just the outer layer of that which was permissible, because only an outer layer absorbs some prohibited taste. Sometimes the isur penetrates even deeper, and for that you have to remove what we call kedei netila. Kedei netila is removing the thickness of a finger, and sometimes the davar ha'asur penetrates completely, and this really has to do with if something hot and cold had a contact, who's on top. Again, the machlek is between Rav and Shmuel, and a lot more. Chavir, let us start on Daf Ayin Hey Amid Aleph. We left off 2 lines from the top of the Amid by the 2 dots, when the Gemara is referring back to the Mishnah, when the Mishnah said that Ein Soilenas HaPesach, right? The Mishnah said explicitly that you may not roast the Pesach, not on a metal spit. That was the beginning of the Mishnah, that we used dafke a wooden spit, nor on a askala, nor on a metal grill. And the challenge we had learning the Mishnah is right after the Mishnah says what you may not do, that Amar Rab Tzadok, the Mishnah says, Maisa Rabbi Gamliel, that told his Evet Ravi, go and roast for me a Pesach on an askala. And that's the Gemara, Maisa Lister, you're bringing a story that contradicts the din that we learned in the Mishnah. Says the Gemara, must be that there are words that are missing from the Mishnah. It doesn't mean that the words were actually missing from the Mishnah. The words of the Mishnah of Mishnayos are precise. Braisas sometimes got corrupted, and therefore sometimes Braisas taka need to be amended by the Mishnah. Rabbeinu HaKadosh, like when the Chumash is written, there are many layers in the understanding of the Chumash, and therefore it's like a puzzle to make everything fit. Sometimes the choice of words doesn't work so good on the level of pshat, but it's needed for you to see the level of drush, v'chulei. Same thing in the Mishnah. There's so many different ways of understanding the Mishnah that for some reason, Rebbe found it important not to write the following words. It was never written in there, but he expected of us to figure out that there is something that has to be inserted. And that is, that v'im askala minu keves. Yes, we may not have any of the meat of the Pesach touching the metal grill, like we explained in the Mishnah, because the Pesach meat has to be fire roasted. And if it's going to be touching a burning hot metal, metal is not fire. That metal will warm up part of that Pesach. That will be a problem, because then that part of the meat won't be prepared fire roasted. However, if the grill is perforated, now Rashi holds a perforated grill means like our grills, that it's not that it's a sheet of metal with little holes in it, but there are actually metal bars going across, and there is a large amount of space between each metal bar. You have the Pesach inserted in, like we learned in the Mishnah, a spit, a wooden spit, and the metal bars, the different bars are so distant one from the other that you are able to lay the wooden spit, one end on one bar, metal bar, the other end of the spit on another metal bar, and none of the meat will ever touch the metal bars. In other words, it's an askala that you can use without having metal touch any of it. Now, one might have still argued, don't use metal at all, because if the person is going to move around the Korban Pesach, then it might end up touching the metal. That is what we need not be afraid of. There is no such gezeda. So the im askala MERCAVA, Rashi says, and therefore no meat will touch the metal, then it's permitted. That is the line that we have to insert, and on that we have a proof from the story. And Amar Rab Tzadok, Ma'asav Amar Gamliel, She'amar Lo Tavi Avdoi, say, go, slay, lanos a Pesach, go indeed, and roast for us our Pesach, halo askala MERCAVA, is a raya that we're not concerned that it's going to touch the metal. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'akol nivra dvarim. All right, Chavre, here we go. 6 lines from the top of the Amid. Ba'a minei Rav Chinana bar Idi, from Mirav Ada bar Ahava, the following inquiry. Tanur shehisikoi beklipei arlam. If a oven was fired up using the klipa of arla fruit, which may not only not be eaten, but we may not have any hana'am. And if you remember, on Daf Chavav, we had the Shita of Rabbi, that if those klipos, which might only now be coals, but still they are in the oven, and you put a bread in the oven, one may not consume the bread, even though you're not eating the arla, because Rabbi subscribes to the opinion that shvach eitzim goes into the pas, and therefore eating the bread is considered having hana'ah from the klipei arla. 1 second, let's go further. And now, ugirafai, now you completely shoveled it clean. So what you have is you have the heat that was produced from something from which we may not benefit. That heat is in the walls of the oven. But the item itself that's asur b'hana is b'chlal not here. And now, v'afa bayas hapas, and you put bread into it. So the question was, l'divrei ha'oiser, if the coals, if the klipas were still in, which is Rebbe, because shvach eitzim b'pas, in our case, yeah, I know that the heat that is in the walls of the oven was produced from klipei arla, but it's already one step removed. The arla itself is completely not here. Mahu, do we still say that the bread may not be consumed? Or here we can have the bread. Oh, the heat is a secondary product. So Amalei, to which Rav Ada bar Ahava responded that hapas muteres. Amalei, hold on. Veha Amar Rab Chinana Sava, Amar Rab Asi, Amar Rab Yechanan, Tanur sheisikoi v'garfoi. That if you have a oven that was fired up and now you shoveled out. Now here we're not speaking about klipei arla. Here we're just speaking about the obligation of having the Pesach meat roasted by fire. So if there was fire, there were coals on fire, and that warmed up the oven, and now you shoveled out the oven, and now v'tzalo b'yasah Pesach. So Rabbi Yechanan, it said in the name of Rabbi Yechanan that ein zet tzli eish. This is not called fire roasted. Why is it not called fire roasted? Not because it's already secondary. The heat is already not direct. No, he said it's not fire roasted because when it came to the Korban Pesach, when it comes to the Korban Pesach, the Torah writes not once but twice tzli eish. Shenemar tzli eish shtei pa'amim, which means that it has to be directly roasted by fire. So what's this question? Talmud Rabbi Yechanan is taka paskening, but only based on the fact that the Torah wrote that twice. If the Torah would only have written Sli'es once, then hava minot sli eshu. Because I don't care that the heat in the wall, so to say, is a product of the coals, it's still considered sli esh. So going back to the case of the orla, the bread should still be prohibited according to Rabbi, who holds shvach eitzim b'pas. And here we have a very important answer, and that is Amar lei gali rachmana hasam v'yalfinon mina. You're right that if the Torah would not have written sli esh twice, Rabbi Yochanan would not have said what he said. But the Torah
do you understand that God has to say things twice to mean it? I don't understand.
No. Very good. God doesn't have to say something twice to mean it. The question is, when God makes a statement, how much do we limit that statement? How precise does it have to be? And that's already a complex question. Yeah, God says fire roasted. Now, what does that mean? Does it have to be directly on fire? Or in our case, the oven was heated through fire. That heat is what's going to roast the Pesach. Maybe that's still included in fire roasted. You can argue that. Now, the Torah writes it twice because God, to make it clear that he wants it direct, wrote it twice. But we don't say it's only where God wrote it twice does it have to be that direct. No. Now that Hashem wrote it one time by Pesach, from there we learned for the rest of the Torah that when something needs to be, direct means direct. We define better what direct means. That's the way it works. Or I'll tell you, says the Gemara, the Hassan over there, Tamad the Kos of Rachman at Tzliyesh Leish Pamim indeed, and Holy Kos of Rachman at Tzliyesh Leish Pamim. Don't forget, what would we have thought without God writing it twice? We want it to be Eish. We're looking for fire. Eish Kapid Rachmana. Okay. Hashem was particular about roasting it with the heat of fire. We want the heat to be from fire, and therefore we would have thought, afilu garfeinami, even if you already shoveled out the fire, nevertheless, the heat is from fire. Now, yeah, God wrote it twice to be megala that it has to be from the fire directly. But without it, at least you have the heat from the fire. Now, what comparison are you making to the case of an orla, which one may not have hana'ah from? Over there, what did the Torah say? The Torah prohibits wood. The Torah prohibits the wood, the klipa, the fruit. The Torah doesn't prohibit the fire at all. Ha'etzim, the isura kokapa drachmana. There's no mention of fire. So the moment you remove the eitzim, so therefore, even though the product that came from the eitzim, here it's too removed. And therefore, indeed, he stood with this psak din that even according to Rabbi, when you completely shovel out the klipi arlam, you are allowed to eat the bread. Okay, so now we're speaking about good sli esh, and what does it mean, and how direct does it have to be? So now we're going to continue on this sugya. So Tana Rabbanan, and by the way, this also connects a little bit to what we learned on the Ayin Dalad Amud Beis when we were learning about Hilchas Melicha. The difference between putting something on a spit over the fire. There, the fire sucks the blood out a lot stronger versus putting the umtza on coals. Now let's come into the Korban Pesach, putting it on coals. Chatachai, if a person not cut as in severing, we learned that the Korban Pesach has to be roasted as one unit, but we're simply speaking about the way people would roast things on fires, that they would make certain incisions in it, which would also allow the blood to flow out better. It would allow for the heat, not only like a yeshiva bacher making food, the outside is burnt and the inside is raw. That's what happens in yeshiva when you make food. So when you make little incisions in it, the heat goes in a little bit better. Those incisions do not create a problem in the preparation of Korban Pesach. It's not considered, it's not one unit, it's one unit. So chatachai unasane al gabe gechalim. So it's not that there's a fire and you have a spit and you have the Korban Pesach over it. You are putting it on coals. Now, Chevra, let's chazer. There is the fire going out of the coal, that's fire. But as we all know, or many of us know, if you ever once witnessed a barbecue, or if you made a barbecue, that the fire dies down. After there is no physical fire shooting out of the coals, there are two types of coals that halacha defines. There is gecholim oimimis. Gecholim oimimis in English is smoldering coals when it's completely, there's no more redness. There's no more little bit of fire in it. Garnish, it's completely quieted down, it's silented down. And then you have what we call gechalim loy chashois, which is what we're talking about right now. It's called flickering coals. It's not, there's no fire shooting out of it, but there's some fire there. So the question is that if you cut the meat and you put it on such coals, there's not mamish fire, it's like red hot coals. Flickering coals. So Rabbi says, Oimer ani shezetz liyesh. And a beautiful flow. No, it's on one hand, liyesh has to be direct, but it doesn't have to be mamish, a big flam fire. The cholim loy chashois are considered fire, and therefore the Koren Pesach is okay. And again, guys, mamish from here all the way through, we're going to have the Gemara challenging the Shita of Rabbi. Says the Gemara, Rami lei Rav Achad voy bar Ami l'Rab Chizda. The challenge was not asked to Rebbe, it was asked in the later generations, but against Shitas Rebbe, the following contradiction. Mi Amar Rebbe, did Rebbe say that gecholim, that coals, loichashois, are considered fire? Halachically, v'neminu, I have the following contradiction. Now, this is a braisa that we're quoting that's connected to a detail in the laws of tzora'as, and just generally, when you have this tzora'as, this leprosy that develops on healthy skin, there are various rules that define when it is considered halachically a sign of leprosy and when not. And then you have a unique case, the Torah calls it michvas eish, if someone's skin got burnt with fire and it's starting to heal. And within the healed area, again, some simanei tzoras begin to develop, which is the skin becoming whiter or the skin becoming redder. Here you have different rules of what will define, what will make that person into a mitzvah or not. So there's the category known as michvas eish. Okay, so the Torah says that michvas eish, says the Baraisa, Eli elo shenichva be'eish, which is the literal case. And again, in this area which was burned, you have some simanim with all of the unique halachas of a burned tzoras. What happens, says the Baraisa, if the person's skin got burned, God forbid, but not with fire? That's the way we're going to learn it right now. We're going to change the understanding at the end of the sugya. But nichva begacheles, if the skin got burned with a coal. Don't forget that Rabbi just said that a coal and fire halachically is mamish the same, so that's already not going to fit. If fire is one thing, but if it gets burnt with a coal or beremetz or with hot ashes, or if the skin got burned b'sitrei seach with boiling lime, or b'gisbis seach with boiling gisbis, or v'chol davar habam and or any other thing that became hot through fire, and the Gemara interrupts parenthetically and wants to just clarify, what are we adding? Says the Gemara, if you have water heated by fire, but it wasn't fire directly that burnt the skin, but it was that water, minayin, how do I know that? Yes, that we subject that location with the rules of a tzoras, of a burn, and we don't apply the rules of tzoras to normal skin. Maybe, but how do you know that? The Torah says michvas eish. Maybe eish means only if the skin was burnt directly with fire. So there also Talmud Leimer, the Torah says twice michva, riba, which includes even all of these above cases. Here we have a similar question to what we had above. Taima the Rabbi Rachmana michva. Now the fact that the Torah wrote it twice, and by the way, Baruch, what you should be asking over here is, we just had above tzli'esh, which has to be directly in fire. Here we're saying michva, double broadens. That's a big problem. We'll speak about that another time. Like, how do we determine when something is doubled? So is it narrowing the application, or is the doubling of God's words broadening it? And just one final thing, I just want to go back to what you mentioned. Really, we know these laws because God explicitly told it to Moshe Rabbeinu. The whole Gemara is trying to discover where can we find in the written Torah a source to the rules that we already know. That it goes in that direction. Not that we knew we were clueless, and then when we read the scripture, it said it twice, we figured that out. Because when you read something twice, your taka can go in many directions. The whole Gemara is, we have the oral Torah is the main Torah. Is the main, we know because God told Moshe all the details. The goal of the whole Talmud is to find the link between the oral Torah and the written Torah. That's a very important klal. But coming back over here. So the Braisa says, michva, twice. Riba. So here says the Gemara, meaning, had the Torah not written the word twice, that I would have thought that michva or michvas eish means only directly by fire. And if a person's skin, God forbid, would have gotten burnt by a coal, then it would not have been included in the laws of tzaras of a burn. So that goes against Rabbi. By Koren Pesach, Rabbi says that coals, right, not oimemois, but that's considered fire. So Amalei, so he responded, no, that's not a problem, because gachele shel eitz, if the coal was a wooden coal, wood that burns, then lo yitzrach kol rabuye, which is the case of Rabbeinu HaKadosh, who said that oimerani, that even though there's no fire coming out of it, as long as the coals are still flickering, it's considered fire. Don't forget that wood itself was on fire. So the fire is not that externalized, but there's fire in there. However, the verse that we needed in the Braisa was what happens if there was a metal coal. Now, I know that metal gets red hot, but metal is not on fire the way wood is on fire. That's why you needed to have an extra michva. Weiter. Says the Gemara, hold on. V'gachela shel mateches lav eshu. Now we're going in the opposite direction, which is all based on the Braisa, that it cannot be. Which if she commits adultery, you have the unique halacha of a bas kohen, as we have in Parshas Emor. But eish tisareif, unlike normally the punishment for committing adultery is either chenek or skila. We'll learn about this in Sanhedrin. But a bas kohen gets the misa of burning. And now let's review some halachas. How do we execute someone through burning? Not the way you imagine, burning someone in fire, but v'amar av masna, that how was this done? Psilo shel avar. They took a lead. They took a wick or a chunk of lead and they would burn it up. They would make it liquidy. It would become what we call molten lead. Now, this is considered in the category not of wood, because lead also doesn't burn up. It becomes red hot or it melts. This is like a metal, that when you burn up a metal, it becomes liquefied. And then they would pour it down this person's throat. So the Torah says, bo'esh tisarif. With fire you should burn her. And here we're saying that molten lead, which should be similar to a metal coal, is considered fire. The Gemara says, no, hold on. Shani Hassan over there by Sreifa. Indeed, if the Torah only would have said with fire, I never would have included molten lead. But the Torah adds a word, bo'esh tisaref, which is taka extra. The Torah could have written bo'esh. You will understand. You got to burn her bo'esh. Why? With fire burner, so tisaref l'rabba is called sreifa is habois min ha'esh. So the Gemara says, hold on. As if really ba'esh means fire. That's really the word tisaref is adding even that which is normally not considered fire. If that's the case, then fire is better. So it's the add-on is the lead. So the kolchchen eitz atzma. So the nakav lachavil is moedus v'nikla. So surround her with bundles of wooden branches and burner. So the Gemara says, no, that can't be. Why not? Because Asya Sreifa, we have a Gzeira Shava from Bnei Aharon, Nadav and Avihu, who entered and they offered a Eish Zara with all the different interpretations, exactly what was their failing, right? They had Ratzi without Shuv. And the way Chazal tell us, and the Gemara tells us in Sanhedrin Daf Nun Beis, that Kimin, I'm reading inside the Rashi, quoting the Gemara, Kimin Beis Chutim Shel Eis, that there were two little like lines, strands of fire entered their noses, and their bodies remained intact. In other words, they passed away, but it was some sort of internal burning. So Malahal and Seifas Neshama, the Neshama was burnt or disconnected from their body, but their body remained intact. So the reason why we don't surround a person who's chayv mitzvahs sreifa with bundles of branches and burn it, because afkan sreifas neshama v'guf kaim. But still, asks the Gemara, if all we are looking for is to have the body intact, there's another way of taking one's life through sreifa, and it doesn't have to be directly in fire, but eish tisaref, it can be something that became hot from fire. It can be one removed from fire, and you can do it in a way that the body remains intact. And what is that? You can boil up water, and you can put the person in the boiling pot. So again, it's from fire. So even though it's not directly fire, but the sarif is adding that, and the goof will remain intact. So that you can do. Mishum de Rav Nachman. The Amar Rav Nachman Amar Kra v'yahavta l'reyacha kamoicha. I know it sounds funny. We had this in Saita also. That's Avos Yisrael. Oh, but it's very meaningful. Avos Yisrael means that even if there's a person that is being put to death by a Sanhedrin, and this happened maybe once in 70 years, that means this must be a very wicked person. So one can argue that there comes a certain point when people are so off the right track, they're such rebels that you don't have to have Avos Yisrael. Even someone that's being put to death by a Sanhedrin, you have to still have L'Riyacha Kamoicha. And what does that mean? If the Torah says they have to be put to death, you have to put them to death. It means B'roi L'Loi Misa Yafa. Misa Yafa means a less agonizing death. Now, the Torah says Sreifa, so it has to be somehow through Sreifa. So what can you use that is at least a fire derivative, that is the least agonizing, and it allows the body to remain intact? That is exactly the way this person was put to death, by having mold and lead poured down their throat. Now, Rav Nachman, right? So, which is Avos Yisrael. So why do we bechlal need the Gezerah Shava? So says the Gemara, no, you still need the Gezerah Shava that we have to learn from Bnei Aharon, that the body has to remain intact, because there are other ways to minimize the agony, but it won't be through pouring mold and lead. Ilav, they answered, Ilav Gezerah Shava Havamina Seifes Neshama V'Guf Kayim La Sreifahi. No, burning means burning, nothing should remain. And I Mishum Rav Nachman, how can we do that in a more, in a less agonizing way because of Avos Yisrael? Nepo Shloch Havilis Moidois Tuva. Take many branches, make a bigger fire. So Kitamos, the first white line, we have a word that is not that commonly used in the Gemara, but we hear it every day many times, right? In the Kaddish, Ba'agola ubizman korev. Now you have the word here. Ba'agola means very quickly. And we're asking for Mashiach to come. That she'll die quickly. The Avos Yisrael should be burning, but quickly. Kumash Malan, no, Gezerah Shava, that the body has to remain intact, and therefore, Nachamol, it's done by pouring mold in lead. So asks the Gemara, opposite question. Why did the Torah have to write the words Ba'esh? Why do you have to write Ba'esh? Write Tisarif. Just write Tisarif means something that is in the world of burning, and we would come to the same conclusion. So answers the Gemara, even though we don't have to use fire direct, but this lead needed to be melted, brought to boiling from fire. And what other alternative would you have? So there is sometimes in the ground, right near a volcano, that halachically we're not going to consider that through fire. There's a lot of heat that you can have avor meikari. You can have naturally mold and lead. That may not be used. The second white line, because you have this extra tisarif, is larabois kol sreifos habois machmas va'esh. Right, as long as the source was fire, but the derivative from it, that which is secondary from fire, is also included. Hold on, another halachim. Now, details of Param Anisrafim, we're going to have a lot in the Sechtas Hoydiyas. Generally, a korban chatos comes from a goat or from a lamb, and it's offered on the outer altar, and the meat part is consumed by Kohanim. But there are three cases where the korban chatos is brought from the larger animal type, a par, an ox. And one of the details of that is that after the avodah is done, after the parts, the fats, the emurim are burnt on the altar, the meat has to be burnt with all of the pratim that they're not even burnt, not in the azara. And the meat is not burnt in Yerushalayim. The meat is burnt dafka chutz mishalosh machnas, and it was burnt on Har HaZeisim. And as we're going to learn a detail, that there is a location on Har HaZeisim where they would put the ashes of the altar. Now, let's not forget, really, every day, the first thing we did in the morning was a kohen ran up the altar and he took one shovel full of ashes, but that shovel was placed right near the ramp. And that was one of the miracles that happened daily, that even though the floor of the Azara was made out of marble, made out of a stone, it got absorbed in the ground. And they would leave all of the rest of the ash on the altar. It was considered the beauty of the altar that there was a pile of ashes on it. And they called it the apple, the tapuach. But nevertheless, after a while, there was too much ashes. So every once in a while, they would completely clean away the ashes. Those ashes were taken out to a place on Har HaZeisim, and it is the meat of the Parim HaNasrafim that were burnt in that location. Okay. Now, this is in Parshas Vayikra, the Saraf Oishoy Al Eitzim Bo'esh. I know that the order is inverted. You know, the word V'Saraf is written first. The word Eish is written second. Unlike the opposite direction that we were going, Bo'esh by Emoy, Bo'esh the Sarif, but still we have two words. And we established that one is superfluous. The Tanya, we learned in a Braisa, no, that Bo'esh, that these Parim, Dafka fire, not with burning lime, not with boiling lime, not with boiling gispis. So l'chayra, how is it that by the Bas Kohen, Bo'esh T'Saref, we are including molten lead? So here we're going to learn an application, what normally we call klal uprat versus prat uklal. It's important which is written first and which is written second. If the term that's used first is a more general term, and the term that's used second is a more defined term, that's the reason the Torah went in that direction to go down. Don't allow it to be a broader application, limit it. If God writes first the more limiting word and the second word is a broader word, then we're going in the direction of going from something limited to going to something that's more inclusive. We're going to include more options. The 3 lines before the bottom of the Amid. Over there, Hassan, by the Bas Kohen, Ba'esh, then T'Saref. Ba'esh Taka would have meant with fire. But now that God added the word T'Saref, that's the hint to us in the written Torah. Is called and that can be molten lead. It has to be melted by fire. But fine, but the koyach of fire is in it. Over here, by the Parim HaNasrafim, first it says the Saraf, which is a more generic word. Then the Torah writes Ba'esh, L'basoif Eish. That's Lememra, that's Fakir. The last word is Eish, to limit it. The Eish in Mida Achrina Loi. Says the Gemara, no, you're not getting away with that. Frek the Gemara, hold on. Hassan Nami by Parim HaNasrafim. You're right. First the Torah writes V'Saraf. You're right. Then the Torah writes the limited word Ba'esh. But you know what? It's like a klal, uprat, uklal. But then the Torah all writes again, right? Even though Hassan Nami ksiva Sreifa L'basoif, the Chsiv Daf Ein Heyamid Beis Al Shefach Hadeshen Yisaref, that it has to be burnt, like we mentioned, on the place where the ash that was removed completely from the altar, not the daily ash, was placed. So here you have the Saraf Oisoi, the Saraf Oisis, the Saraf, right? Al Eitzim Bo'esh. So it's a broader word, a more limiting word, but then it says in the same pasuk, Al Shefach Hadeshen Yisaref, go at the end, Yisaref. So the Gemara says, no, that word is already used. Who answers the Gemara? Yisaref, Yisaref, that you burn the Parim HaNasrafim, those 3 meats, even if while you took it there was no ashes. We don't need it. If not for that, you would think you have to wait for there to be ashes, or there's always ashes on the altar. Take ashes, place it there first, and then put it, the Torah says clearly, Al Shefach Hadeshen. You would think it means literally on the ashes. Or another limud we learned from the final word Yisaref, Afalpi, Shehitzis Ha'ar Berubai, you would think that if fire already burnt most of those meats, you were yoitza the mitzvah. And many times in halacha, Rubai, Kekulai. So Yisaref is to tell you all that has to be burnt. So that Yisaref is needed. So therefore, don't tell me that there's a Yisaref at the end. It's really the broader word, then Bo'esh, which is why we limit it to fire. Now, let's not forget that all of this began with what? The flow. Rabbi made a statement that if a Korban Pesach is put on coals, not on fire, on coals, as long as they are loy chashois, we're adding that because that's what the Rishonim keep on adding, then Rabbi says you properly prepared the Korban Pesach, even though the Torah says that it has to be tzli eish. Problem we had was that by Tzoras, we had a Braisa, the Torah is speaking about michvas eish, and if not for an extra michva, then we only would have understood the dinim of michvas eish if the skin was burnt with fire. If the skin was burnt with coals, then we would not have included it in the halachas of michvas eish. That was the problem. So Ravina says, you're not learning the Braisa correctly, you put the comma in the wrong place. Don't read the Braisa that it says michvas eish. I would have known fire, comma. That's the way we learned it on Amud Aleph. But how do you know to add also coals? No. The case of the coals is written right after the fire. put the comma after the word coals. K'roich v'tani, combine the second case with the first case. Michvas eish, we're just quoting the same words in the Braisa, putting the comma in a different place. That is included in Michvas eish. Like Rabbi Taka said, Sli eish means eish doesn't only mean a fire that you would call fire, it means coals. The coals cannot be smoldering, there has to be some redness in them, or, but that's good. How do you know nichva beremetz, that if the skin was burned with the ashes, or besidrei seach with boiling lime, or begispis reseach, or b'chol davar habachal machmas so'or, and again la'asuye chami ha'or minayin, that for that you need to have michva riba. But if not, you would not have included the remetz, you would not have included lime. But gachelis is automatically part of nichva bo'esh fakert weiter. Okay, Rava pointed out the following contradiction. Umi amar Rabbi, which is what he said. Oimer ani, that gecholim ikre eish, right? That coals are classified as fire. Vidiminu, avnacha contradiction. This Braisa, my friends, is speaking about the avoida that happens on Yom Kippur through the Kohen Gadol. Part of his avoida is that he has to take a shovel full of fiery coals from the top of the altar, and he goes with them into the Kodesh HaKodashim. And as we'll learn in Yuma, this was one of the hardest avoidas that he did. We're speaking about the technical of it, because he needed to have also the ketaitis that was extremely refined. And then he needed to pour the ketaitis on top of the coals, and how do you hold, what is held where? Some of it is held in his mouth. We're going to learn in Yuma details. But here we're quoting the following. It says in Abraisa, Gachle, he has to take coals from the altar. So Gachle, you would think if the Torah only would have written the words coals, Yachel, even if they are oimimais, even if they're no longer flickering. This is like the coals in their weakest state. Gachalam oimimais. So the Torah says, no, Gachle eish. So what does eish teach you? L'chayra. So eish means, you would think, according to Rabbi, eish would mean it can even, if it's loy chashois, it's good. But that's not what the Braisa says. The Braisa says that the Torah, if the Torah only would have written the word eish, you would think eish is only a fire itself. Now, just to make it clear, how would you take fire itself? Fire meaning you don't even need a coal. So if you take a pan, which is what he used anyways, and you would smear it with oil, and you would light it with the fire that is on top of the altar, so there's a while. Ever happened to you? You're making something, again, a yeshiva bachar on the stove, and you're putting the oil, and when you're beating up the eggs, you forgot that there's oil on the fire. There will come a time that the whole thing will go on fire. That's what we're to know. There's no coals. The oil is burnt. Maybe fire means just fire. Now that's a problem, because the Braisa's Havamina is that Eish means a shall heves. According to Rabbi, Eish should mean at least Gecholim Leichashois, but he's not saying that. Eish would mean a fire. That's why God wrote both. Gachle Eish, Tamalimi Gachle. So Harkeisad, what's the in between? Maybe Mina Leichashois. We're going to, Rashi does not have the parentheses, we'll skip it. So really, this is a contradiction on Rebbe, but the Gemara points out it's really an inherent contradiction. For Haguf Akasha. Omanat Gachle. What was the Havamina? The Havamina of the Braisa was that if only Gachle, you would think Oimamois. What does that imply? Not that Gachle, you would think Oimamois and Loichashois. No. That Gachle Yachol Oimamois. The fact that the Braisa did not include Loichashois implies Alma Loichashois is fire. It's not coals. So why does the Braisa say later, if the Torah only would have written Eish, you would think it has to be only a fiery flame or a flame, and Talmud Leimer Gachle Alma that Afilo Loichashois Laveish Ninu. So which one is it? A sign of it being a contradiction against Rebbe. So Amar Absheish is Hachi Kitani. That if the Torah only would have written regarding what the Kohen Gadol takes from the altar, Gachle, coals, Nekuda, without adding the words fire, indeed, I would have thought Bein Oimamois, Bein Loichashois. That's what coals mean. No matter if the fire in there is complete, it's smoldering coals, whether it's flickering coals. So Talmud Leimer Eish. Now, so Eish means not coals. And indeed, Eish, if the Torah only would have written Eish, not Gachle Eish, just Eish, then I would have thought Taka only a fire. So the Torah writes both, gachle. So what's the middle ground? Haketzad, maybe min aloy chashois. Now, if this is the understanding of the Braisa, this contradicts the Rebbe. Mikol makim frek the Gemara, you see that gecholim, just gecholim, lo yikra eish, and that goes against Shitas Rebbe. Gewaldig. So Amar Abaye, that Rab Shesh's interpretation, Taka doesn't work. Rebbe, for sure, understood this Braisa differently. Amar Abaye Teritzachim, that if the Torah would have written Gachle, Yochel, I would have understood that to mean only Oyamais and not Loy Chashois. Perfect. Because Loy Chashois is fire. Talmud Leimer Eish. Now, if the Torah would have only written the word Eish, then I would have thought you have an option. Yochel Ratza Shal Heves. Yavi, Ratza Gacheles Yavi, because both are Eish. Fire itself, just on a pan with oil, that's fire for sure. And Enochanami like Rebbe. And Gechalim Loy Chashois is also Eish. But you would have an option. That's why God wrote Gachle Eish. Tamalame Gachle Haketzad, maybe Min Aloy Chashois. So, for Enfers, Abaye, by understanding the Braisa in a way that it will not only will it not contradict the Rebbe, Adarabba, it will subscribe to the same Shita that Gecholim Loy Chashois Ikra Eish. Says the Gemara, Amar, we're going to go with the version. Amar Rava, to his colleague, to Abaye, you're telling me that if the Torah only would have written Eish, Ratza Gacheles Yavi, Ratza Shal Heves Yavi, that doesn't make sense. Because Shal Heves, how indeed do you bring fire without any coals? Keep going like we explained, the Shafya Lamana Mishcha, that you smeared the pot with oil, and the Itle Beinoid, and you light it up on fire. That would be fire. Now, if the Torah only gives you that option, if this is what God wants, okay, this is what God wants. But if you have a word that has dual meaning, why would you even think to understand it, to interpret it in a way that way is not considered respectful? Interesting. I don't play with fire, so I don't understand what's respectful, what's not respectful, but the Gemara is telling us over here, if you are to bring fire in front of a king, you would never just smear oil in a pot and bring fire. It's not nice. It's not a proper fire, or the fire might go out. It's not something ideal. Now, just appreciate something. If this is what God says to do, that's what God wants. But if you are telling me, like according to Rebbe, that if the Torah would have written the word Eish, it has dual meaning because Gechalim Ikra Eish, but Eish is also called Eish, then you would think there's either A or B, and that's why God needed to write the words Gachle Eish. No, don't write the word Gachle. Misfara, if it has a dual application, apply it, do it in a more respectful way. Now, Rava is not going back to Rab Shesh's interpretation. That is a problem against Rebbe. Elo Amar Rava Teritzachim. This is the way we have to interpret the Braisa. If the Torah only would have written the words Gachle, then again I would have understood Gachle only means Oymemois and not Loy Chashois. Talmud Leimer, that's why God writes the word Eish. And obviously Eish includes Loy Chashois, like Rebbe. Flickering coals is fire, and you can roast a Koren Pesach on flickering coals. However, it's taka not respectful to walk into the Kodesh HaKodshim with just a fire. But when you remove these coals from the altar, at that time will it bother me that some of it is flickering away, flaming away, or do I already want it then to be only flickering coals and not pure fire? I would think that when you remove it from the Mizbeach, and guys, it doesn't last that long. In other words, when a coal is flaming up, it's going to die down quickly. And if the disrespect is to enter the Holy of Holies with a big fire shooting up, fine. By the time you will get there, it's all going to be a Gechalim Loy Chashois. But it should not bother us. You would think that you remove it off the altar when it's still half Shalhevis. Because by the time you're going to get to the inside, so that's why the Torah writes the last narrow line, we have to quote the whole verse to apply the extra word gachle. Eish only would have made a coal, but I want for all of the coal not to be, there shouldn't be any flaming fire. We want it to be flickering. Mishas Likicha Neheva already on the stage of Gecholim, but again, Fakert, not only does this Braisa not contradict Rabbeinu HaKadosh, but Adarabba, the Braisa Zaraya, that what? That Gecholim is called fire. And now, guys, we did have this also. We had this on Brachas, we had this on Shabbos. How do you spell Oimemois? With the Aleph or with an Ayin? Yibaylahu Oimemois or Oimemois. Right, smoldering is with the Aleph or an Ayin. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, he brings a pasuk from Yecheskel. The pasuk, according to Rashi, is speaking about the greatness of Melech Tzur, Chiram Melech Tzur, that he had a lot of stature. He was a very impressive person, and he was so impressive that Arazim Loy Amamu began Elokim. That when he was in a beautiful garden, this is the way Rashi teaches. And normally cedars are the most impressive trees, but Chiram Melech Tzur wasn't, so to say, overshadowed by the splendor of the arazim, of the cedar trees. Even the cedars were unable to minimize the greatness of Chiram. So the fact that you have the words amamuhu with an ayin, meaning dimming, so the dimmed coal, the smoldering coal, should be spelled with an ayin and not with an aleph. And now, Chevra, we're going to continue with the new Mishnah. And what we are going to learn in the next daf, beginning right now, is one of the most foundational sugyas when it comes to kashrus. So we did learn last daf about melicha. Now we're going to learn about the mixture of the taste, of the flavor between two foods that had contact, and we'll see halachic contact, and sometimes the flavor of one penetrates the other. Now, one very important intro that will repeat when we start next daf, that when we speak about kashrus, never confuse the food itself, the be'en, versus the taste that is coming from a food. Food itself, be'en, is nullified in majority. So, for example, if a person were to have, that's the classical case, you have 3 pieces of meat, 2 of them are kosher, 1 of them is not. Obviously, if you can discern, if you can notice, there's a sign, there's a packaging, there's a hechshed, which one is which, of course you have to remove the non-kosher, take it out. But if there's a mixture, and we don't know what is kosher and what's not, so if there is no penetration of the taste, if there's no invasion of taste, there's no mixture of the tam, there's no taroivis, it's only about the be'en, there the rule is batal b'roiv. With all of the nuances, batal b'roiv doesn't mean that you can cook all 3 pieces of meat all together, because you know that one of them is not kosher, but halachically you can remove 1 piece of meat, and then you ask, is this from the kosher or is this from the non-kosher? Well, the majority was kosher. It came from the kosher. And you can do the same with the second. And theoretically, you can do the same with the third, even though that we are machman, we the Ashkenazim, that one of them is going to be thrown out. However, coming back here, the focus will be about the mixture of taste, as we'll learn. Now, another thing, we began the Pedic, Ketzat Soilen, by emphasizing that the Koren Pesach has to be roasted by fire, and you can't use a metal spit. The metal became heated up through the fire, but it's not directly on fire. So now we're going to learn the following, that you are roasting your Koren Pesach, and noga becharsoy sholtanur, and the carcass, the meat touches the earthenware surface of the oven. Guys, the oven, I know the oven was warmed up through fire, but the oven is not fire. So a part of the Pesach which touched that part that touched the outer surface of the earthenware tanur, so some of that heat warmed up that part of the Koren Pesach, and that is not only tzliesh, so you can't consume it. Now, it does not invalidate the whole Koren Pesach. You have to remove that part. So let's go into concepts. How much of it do you have to remove? I know I'm not talking about the expansion of the width and the length. Well, the part that touched, the question is the depth. How deep did the heat penetrate? So the one type of removal is called, we learned this in Shulchan Aruch, kedei klipa. Yikloif es mekoimoy. Peel away that place. Exactly what that means, that is developed later. But that is the smallest depth amount of removal. However, another case, the next case is worse. Notaf meiroitfoi alacheres. Some of the gravy, some of the juice of the Koren Pesach dripped on the earthenware. Now let's presume that the earthenware is hot. We're going to learn details. Was it hot? Was it cold? So now that piece of gravy also has some heat, not directly from fire, but when it drips on the earthenware, sometimes it spritzes back, sprays back. The chazar elav. So now some gravy that taka originally was in the animal was heated only by fire, but now it also got heated from the cheres, and now it's splattered, it spritzed back. So how deep does that gravy penetrate? More than klipa, more than kedei klipa. So how much do you have to remove? And it's called kedei netila in Shulchan Aruch. Yitoy les mekoymai. Rashi writes that it's a lot more beklipa. And we know in halach it's around a finger breadth, the thickness of a finger. Let's not go into those details because there are many different opinions. It's important to remember that the smallest amount is called kedei klipa. The next level is called kedei netila. Another case, notaf meiroit vayala soiles, some of the gravy, some of the juice dropped into flour. Here we're not speaking about when the flour doesn't allow it to splatter back. The flour absorbs it. The question is, can I eat the flour? Why would I not be allowed to eat the flour? Listen to this. Because the gravy warmed up the flour that was surrounding the juice. That flour again shared that heat back with the gravy. So this gravy, the juice, wasn't only warmed by the fire. So how much of the flour do you have to remove? A greater amount. And that is kemitza. Yikmaitz es mekaimai. In other words, you have to fill up your fist full of the flour. You want to get the gravy inside of that location. All of that has to be removed because it has in it some of the flavor of the gravy that is now also warmed up by the flour itself.
But
guys,
where would the flour be in relationship to the Paschal lamb roasting? Somebody just put a bucket of flour underneath it, so to speak?
Very good. So people had the Pesach lamb with the Seder. So just imagine your kitchen, our kitchens, preparing the Seder with one additional add-on, the Koren Pesach. So there was a whole meal there. Correct. Compounded, and I know that nowadays people do not take flour and mix it into water on Pesach. We do all that before because of the potential of it becoming chametz. Then, no, they used to bake bread at night. Yom Tov, you can prepare bread. It's in the kitchen. In the kitchen, there's flour. Before they had all these beautiful plastic containers, what do you think they had? They had up to 1.5 utensils, and it was, laying around over there. Now, by sochoy b'shem and truma. Here, we're not speaking about the issue of it has to be fire heated. Here, we're just speaking about something that I may not eat, had contact with, and it penetrated. So the example will be you have oil of truma, and they are smearing the Pesach with oil. Now, by the way, we're not allowed to prepare the Koren Pesach with liquid because that's called cooking. But a small amount of oil is allowed to be smeared around the meat. That's what happened over here. Now, again, what's wrong with truma? Well, if you're a kohen, absolutely nothing. But if you're not a kohen, everything. I am not allowed to consume truma. So, im chaburas kohanim, if the whole group, everyone is a kohen, adarabba, gesundheit is yoichelu. However, im shal Yisrael, if there's even only one Jew, so then we got a problem. The Yisrael is not allowed to consume truma. So like this, im chayu, if the carcass was raw, when you put the oil around it, raw meat does not absorb. We're going to learn a lot of details. Was it hot? Was it cold? We'll get to that in the Gemara. So then all you need to do is, now we're going in the opposite. We started klipa, kedei netila, kimitza, and now we're going in the opposite direction. Nothing, just rinse it. You got to rinse it. It's on the surface, but it did not penetrate at all. So then yidachenu. However, im salihu, if the meat was previously roasted and then you smeared the oil, so here again says the Mishnah, yes, it penetrates, but how deep? Not kedei netila. Elama yikleifes achitza, and you only have to peel off the outer layer. And the final case in the Mishnah is that sochoy b'shemen shel meiser sheni. What's the issue? Meiser sheni has to be consumed in Yerushalayim. So what's the issue? Koren Pesach is also only allowed to be consumed in Yerushalayim. The issue is that when you had many people registering on one animal, there was a certain amount of money normally that needed to be exchanged, not on Yom Tov, either prior to Yom Tov or after Yom Tov, I got to pay for my part. Now, you may not sell Ma'aser Sheni. No commerce can be done with Ma'aser Sheni. So if you smear the Pesach with Ma'aser Sheni, lo yasenu damim al bnei achabura. You can't charge for that amount. It has to be excluded from any type of money exchange because of the rule that she'ein poigin Ma'aser Sheni b'Yerushalayim. Yeah, of course, if you have produce explicitly in the Chumash and it's too heavy because you think you're too far away. When you're far, things are heavy. When you're close to God, everything is easy. But a guy is fine, doesn't want to schlep it. There, the whole parsha speaks about you redeeming it on money. You have to add a fifth if you're the owner. It has to be on a tzura. It can be on real estate. With all the pratim. But that's all outside of Yerushalayim. Once Ma'aser Sheni is in Yerushalayim, it has to be consumed, and you may not sell it to someone else to consume it in Yerushalayim. So that's the final din of you connected to putting something other than the Pesach on top of the Pesach. Just to conclude, I know that it's really next daf, but just to open up, to finish the daf with the opening of the next daf, which is, now that we began speaking about a absorption issue, that something touched something else and it penetrated, and now sometimes you have to remove kedei klipa, you have to remove kedei netila. Sometimes it penetrates in it all. So now we have to add another whole factor that the Mishnah did not explicitly speak about. It's going to have to fit in the Mishnah. And that is heat. Heat empowers one to penetrate the other. And the same thing in reverse, that when something is hot, it itself is more absorbable. So therefore, cham l'toy cham, if two items were both hot and there was contact, and we're going to review this in the beginning of the next class. Divrei hakol asur, daf ayin vav. Asur means that the permitted, absorbed, the prohibited. Tzoinon l'toich tzoinon, cold in cold, the divrei hakol mutar. There is no absorption. Yeah, you'll have to rinse off, but there's no absorption. With a lot more details. Cham l'toich tzoinon, if hot falls into cold, or if cold falls into hot. Here we have the famous argument. Rav says, Ilo agavar, the one on the top dominates, and Shmuel says, Tata agavar, the one on the bottom dominates. Oh, Piruchni is how important that is, that we, just to know, that we paskin like Shmuel, we are the lowest, we are the tachtoinim, and the power that God gave us, like the Maggid of Mezrich says, that Hashem Tzilcha, God is your shadow, it doesn't only mean that God is protecting us. Of course it means that. It means that just like the shadow follows the movements of the body, that godliness reacts towards what we initiate. Why? Because tata agavar. God willing to be continued. All right. This is going to be great.
It's a famous argument.
Famous argument. Ilo agavar, tata agavar. All right. Whoever loved Chulin will mamish love this. Let's go. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Pesachim Daf Ayin Vav. We are beginning the sugya, speaking about the capacity of food to absorb the ta'am, the flavor, from a neighboring food that had halachic contact with it. We're going to learn here the machloikas between Rav and Shmuel. Rav is the one that says that if two foods had contact, not side by side, but one on top of the other, Rav says that the upper one, the ilo agavar, the upper dominates. Shmuel says tata agavar, the bottom one dominates. We're going to have on the whole Amud Aleph, we're going to try from our Mishnah 3 times to refute the opinion of Shmuel, but we will not refute Shmuel. Not only that, the next half of Ayin Vav Amud Aleph is going to bring 2 braises that will substantiate the Ashita of Shmuel. And indeed, as Rashi, which very rarely paskins halachas, writes here, we'll read it inside, that even though normally when it comes to matters of Isur Beheter, halachic kerav be Isura, halachic Shmuel be Mamoino. but not be Surah. Here will be from the few exceptions that we will paskin like Shmuel, even in a matter of Isser v'Heter, because of our Gemara that ends up bringing not one, but two braises that substantiate the sheet of Shmuel that Tata Agavar. Now we're going to have other details, which will be that even when foods are cold, salty items, will define how salted do they have to be. Salt gives the capacity for food not to absorb, to transfer its flavor to that which it has contact with. That's the koyach of salt. We're going to learn the rule of kavush k'mevushal. Kavush k'mevushal means that if you have two food items, no heat, but they are soaking in the same liquid together, so it's just like they were warmed up together, and when there's heat, then normally heat is that which transfers the taste into the other. We're going to learn the big machlokes between Rashi and the Rosh and many other Rishonim, but it's attributed to them. Rashi holds kavush k'mevushal is only by vinegar. Rosh holds that kavush k'mevushal is even by water, as long as it's soaked together for 24 hours. And just to know, we paskin l'chumra like the Rosh. We will also learn other details about penetration of foods, or the ability for foods to absorb the flavor from a neighboring food, and that is seasoning, tavlin. That seasoning makes, let's go, meat more absorbent to that which is touching it, with all of the many applications that will have. That will be Ayin Vav Amud Aleph. That's one big sugi. Ilah Gavar, Tata Gavar. The whole Ayin Vav Amud Beis until the Mishnah will be another very important machlokes between Rav and Levi. And that is whether Reicha Milsahi, whether aroma is a factor. When you bake two foods together in an oven at the same time, they did not physically touch, but they are uncovered. I'm not talking about on the airplane where things are double wrapped. That's something else, but both food items were open. So what's passing here is the aroma is spreading around in the oven. Reicha Milsahi creates a problem. That is the Shita of Rav. Shita of Shmuel is Reicha Lav Milsahi. If we have time, we're going to mention a secondary issue which is not discussed at all, and that is if they were not baked at the same time. First you baked milchiks, and then in the milchik oven later you put something fleishiks. That's already not called reicha, just that's called zeya. Zeya means the perspiration. It's lesser than reicha. We'll speak about that at least bekitzer, and at the end of Ayin Vav Amud Beis, we're going to come back to Korban Pesach, and as we have been learning that there is a dispensation when it comes to Tumah by Pesach. If the majority of the people are Tamei with corpse Tumah or with Sheretz Tumah, then they bring the Pesach Rishon as long as it's the Roiv. And really, it also if the Roiv of the Kahanim are Tamei, if the Roiv of the utensils are Tamei. So it's going to be, the Tumah will be set aside. And as we mentioned, this is not unique to the Korban Pesach. When it comes to many other Korbanos Tzibur that have a fixed time, they also override, they trump over Tumah. However, the Mishnah will point out that there is one area where the Pesach is even more lenient. It pushes away Tumah even more than the other Karbanos. And that is that when Pesach is brought to Tumah, we eat it as well. And all the other Karbanos Tzibur that the Mishnah will point out, it's it's slaughtered, and the dam is put on the Mizbeach, and the Emurim are burnt on the Mizbeach, which is the main avodah. But the remaining of the meat, because of people being Betumah, it's not eaten, whether it's normally eaten by the Kahanim, it won't be eaten by the Kahanim, it's going to have to be burnt like Psuli HaMikdashim and a lot more. I know we read it at the end of last year. Let's quickly start on Daf Ayin Hey Amud Beis at the end of the Amud. Now we're going to have to remember the case of the Mishnah properly, because like we mentioned, the machlokes of Rav and Shmuel that we will quote here, which is a Shas machlokes regarding Isur v'Heter, we're going to attempt to refute Shmuel from three different parts from our Mishnah. Okay, so let's first, Itman, in the bottom of the Amud, Cham l'toy cham, when you have two foods that have contact, and we're not speaking about the issue of the food itself. Food itself, if you can see it, take out the food that's prohibited, right? If you cannot see it, the food itself is nullified in roiv. However, if it's not just the food, but there is a mingling of flavor, another important detail that we didn't speak out on last class, and that is that if one has 60 times or more than the other, the ratio, not 59-1. If there's a ratio of 60-1, then the flavor of the one is also nullified. The be'en is nullified b'rav. If there is a 60-1, then the tam is batal. We're speaking about a scenario where we don't have that ratio. No, it's if there is a mingling of flavors, then oops, you got yourself a problem. The question will be when and how will there be a mingling of flavors? So if two things are hot, now there are two examples, there are two applications, just to make it clear. There's like a kosher meat and a treifa meat that touched each other, cham l'toy cham. Or you can have, like Rashi speaks about, a more common mingling of flavors, common meaning that we in our kitchens, God, with the help of God, we never have in there non-kosher food. But you have milk and meat, they're both kosher. Elamah, we're not allowed to mix them. What happens if a little bit of milk falls into meat? What happens if meat falls into a pot of milk? That's another mingling of. So same thing, icham l'toicham, divrei hakol aser, meaning that the item that was permitted for sure absorbed the taste of that which is aser, whether it's non-kosher meat or whether it's milk and meat, and therefore you got yourself a problem. Again, the details are not mentioned. Obviously, if you have hot milk, a drop falls into a big pot of meat, but you have 60 against 1 or more, I don't care if there was a mingling. The be'en is batal b'roiv. The tam is batal because the tam is batal. You're good. But if you don't have that ratio, then you got yourself a problem. Daf ayin vav on the top. Likewise, tzoinen l'toich tzoinen, cold and cold. So a piece of meat falls into a bottle of milk. Then divrei hakol muter. Now, we're going to learn more details later. What's that muter? Do you have to rinse it off, right? Or maybe you need a little bit more. Was the meat raw? In the Mishnah, we learned that raw meat doesn't absorb. What happens if the meat is not raw? But there wasn't a full penetration. The question, the area where there is a debate is cham l'toich tzoinen or tzoinen l'toich cham. One was hot, one was cold, and here we are going to have to look at which one was on the top. So Raf says the rule is ilo or gavar, the upper one will dominate. Shmuel says the bottom one, tata'a, will be gavar. Oh, now there are many other nuances to Bekitz late, to Bekitz. One nuance is, does it make a difference into the proportion? The Gemara is not, I mentioned that if it's 60 against 1, okay, then it's batal. But if it's not 60, but if one item is 4 or 5 times more than the other, so you're saying that that hot and cold, basically cold doesn't impart flavor, right? Cold does not absorb flavor, gesund hate. So if we're going to go with, let's go with Shmuel, we paskin like Shmuel. So tata gavar. So tzoinen l'toicham. Tzoinen l'toicham is a problem. What happens if the tzoinen on top is many times more than the cham? Will there be a time where even Shmuel is got, was that much tzoinen and the cham was so little, then the cold dominated the hot? Yes, many poskim do say that, but that's not discussed here explicitly. Very interesting. Okay, 3 lines from the top. Tanan, we learned in our Mishnah, not af miroitvai. If some of the gravy dripped on the earthenware. Now, the Mishnah didn't say, what are we talking about? We're speaking about the oven. The floor of the oven is hot. Are we speaking about a plate later? The plate is cold. But the point there is that when some gravy or some juices drops on cheres, some of it could spritz back, can splatter back, which is the case what happened. And when it splattered back, it entered and touched the meat. So the Mishnah said that was the first case. That you need to remove kedei klipa. No, I take that back. Then what you have to do is you have to do kedei netila. That if it drips on cheres and it splatters back, kedei klipa is not even enough. We learned in the Mishnah kedei netila is the thickness of a finger. End of quote. Now, the question that we had against Shmuel was based on a premise that we're speaking not about that the gravy dripped down on the floor of the oven. So it dripped out there when you were serving it on a plate. Now you get the kasha. The gravy is hot. It dropped on a plate. The plate is cold. So that says ila agavar. So let's go through what happened. You have to remove kedei netila because what happened? The hot gravy touched the cold plate. So now the plate got warmed up. Now I know that the Rav says ilo gavar, not ata gavar, but that's only if they have different temperatures. Cham, I don't care who's on top and who's on the bottom. That's important. So now that they're both hot, so some of the heat of the bottom, even according to Rav, here he's going to say also that the bottom one will be of a influence. Now newly warmed up, heated up cheres, shear some of that heat back with the gravy. Then the gravy gets spritz back and it touches the meat. I know again it's the bottom to the top, but they're both hot. Cham aser. Come mitvei Pesach. So now some of the Pesach also got roasted. Machmas chamimusa decheres, which is why you have to remove that part, because the Rachmana Amar tzli eish v'lo tzli machmas davar acher. It fits perfectly. Problem will be, according to Shmuel, that says that if it's not cham, if it's cham tzoinen, then you have to know who's on top and who's on the bottom. And Shmuel paskins that the tata, that the bottom one, the lower one, is the dominant one. So let's think about it based on the premise that the cheres is tzoinen. So what happened when the gravy touches the cheres? Who dominates who? The bottom one dominates the top one. Akure mekar leila roikav. Fakert. The bottom cold cheres cooled off the gravy. So you have now something cold, tata gavar, that is spritzing back up and touching the meat. Again, tata gavar. So amay yitelas mekaymay. Now we're going to learn later. We're not saying that you're patrivol klum. Okay, fine. But kedei netila, more than kedei klipa, maybe rinsing should be enough. If anything, it's already roasted, it's not raw. Kedei klipa, but why kedei netila? This is a bomb question. So answers the
it's permitted. Is it permitted then? Cold on cold?
Cold on cold is permitted. I just added, Baruch, it depends to what nuance, which is sometimes if cold and cold contacted something that's already roasted or cooked, it goes in a little bit, but you won't need to have the kedei netila, the finger depth. That thickness you won't have to remove. So the Gemara answers just like Rabbi Yirmiyah, Amar Shmuel, said in the name of Shmuel himself elsewhere in the Mishnah. We'll see that in a moment, that we're speaking about besoilis reisachas, that the case in the Mishnah has to be speaking about the flour itself was already preheated up. It was boiling hot flour. Hachinami becheres reisayach. And then it works. Again, cham, there's no machlekes ilah gavar tata gavar. Then one influences the other. And let's go to the next attempted question against Shmuel from our Mishnah. Tanan, we learned in the next part of the Mishnah, not of minoy tvei if some of the gravy dripped into some flour that's there in the kitchen. So then what's the issue? Well, not the issue is not the Pesach, the issue is the gravy. So the gravy now also got heated up from the flour itself, and now this gravy is in the flour. So how much flour do you have to remove? Yikmoitz esmekayma, you have to take a fistful out of the flour. So here again, the one who asked the question against Shmuel based the question on the premise that the Mishnah is speaking about what you would think about flour. Now Bishleim Elirav. Again, same thing. It works perfectly. The Amar, he says, Ilagava. So Mishum Hacha Yikwan Sesmekayme. Let's analyze what happened. Some hot gravy went into flour. The flour is cold, but the upper dominates. The that the gravy warmed up everything that's around it. Ila Agava. So now the flour is hot. Now some of that heat goes back into the gravy. And therefore the gravy, right? Some of it, the gravy was prior warmed by fire, but now it's rewarmed or added warmth, added heat from the heat of the flour. And you have to remove the gravy, and the gravy is liquidy, and it goes into the flour, and you got to remove a whole kedei kemitza. Fine. But Elul Shmuel, that says Tata Gavar. Okay, so let's analyze. So soilus, since the flour was cold, the gravy fell into the flour. If the lower one dominates, so akure komekar lei, so the coldness of the flour cooled off the gravy. So lama leikmoitz es mekaymai. Again, Rashi is not good as the parentheses, or we're not saying that you don't have to do anything, but not the amount of kemitza. So it was here, Amar Rabbi Yirmi, in the name of Shmuel, the flour was hot. I just want to add something interesting. Don't think this is a doichik answer, right? You asked the Baruch, why is there flour? In kitchen, why would it be hot flour? I'll tell you why. Guys, we learned this together. That don't forget that then they would actually bake flour products on Pesach with the danger that you, God forbid, it will become chametz. One of the ways to preempt, to guarantee that even if you mix the flour and the water on Pesach, it's not going to become chametz. Remember the rules that we learned? That anything that was properly heated up in the oven will never become chametz. So it's very likely that flour that you are using to bake products on Pesach, prior to using it, you put it into the oven and you get it boiling hot. And now it takes away the chametz concern. It's like a practical answer. Okay, right. Third attempted question. Tanan, we learned again in our Mishnah that that if they smear the Koren Pesach, right, the carcass with oil of truma, and here the issue is not kosher per se, but for a non-kohen, yeah, it's a kashrus issue. You can't eat truma. Im chaburas kohanim, fine. Yoichelu. But im shal Yisrael, so then im chayu, if the meat was raw, then all you need to do is yidichenu, you have to just rinse it off, because we said that raw meat doesn't absorb. More details in the Gemara soon. Im tzlihu, but if it was already roasted, so then it goes in kedei klipa. The oil goes in a little bit. Yikleif es achitzin. And now again, we're going to ask, bishleim alarav. Again, the presumption is the oil is cold, which says ilah gavar. No, it's even when ilah gavar, here as you see already, it's not ilah gavar and nothing is needed to be done. If the meat is roasted or cooked, epis it absorbed, something it absorbed, kedei klipa is enough. Why not more? Because the oil was cold, the oil dominates, ilah gavar, amtulachi, it's enough beklipa. Mishum dilat soinenu. But according to Shmuel, that says tatah gavar, and the meat here not only is roasted, but the meat is hot. I don't care that the oil is cold, but the hot meat is going to first warm up the oil. Kiven achamu, so mivla bala, it's going to deeply absorb. Hot penetrates more than kedei klipa. So amai sagele beklipa, the first white line, flecting a mother, nitzar legamre. Now, legamre, again, details. Does legamre mean the whole lamb? Lav dafka. It depends how much oil. Nitzar legamre means definitely a lot more than kedei klipa. That's what it means. So answers the Gemara. Shanei sicha, Shmuel holds tatah gavar. And yes, the bottom one is hot. But the mashuhu ba'almuhu da avida. Since you only smeared a very small amount, so how deep can it go? And let's not forget, we mentioned this, I hope, when we learned the Mishnah in the last year, that Bachlal, when we prepare the Korban Pesach, we don't add liquid to it. If you add too much oil, you got a whole new problem. It has to be roasted by the fire. We don't want it to be, so to say, cooked. The definition of cooking is not only in water, is that in its prep, you're adding liquids. Elama, oil, you can add only a little bit. So since it's such a minuscule amount of oil, that's why it's kedei klipa. So first of all, we attempted, not once, not twice, 3 times to refute Shmuel unsuccessfully. Shmuel defended his position. And now Avana Poichu, Punkt verkehrt. Tanya Kavos in the Shmuel, 2 times. Number 1, the first white, the second white line of the Seft and Chulin says clearly, Cham l'tei cham, Asur, v'chein soinen shenas l'tei cham, clear, Asur. What do we see over here? That the bottom one dominates. The bottom one was Cham, so therefore it answers the Tzoinen. Cham l'tei Tzoinen, or Tzoinen l'tei Tzoinen, then all you need to do is just Madiach. You have to rinse it off. So first of all, that's clear that tatah gavar. But the Gemara wants to just clarify a detail. Frag the Gemara on this, but I say, all you need to do is Madiach. Okay, I get it. The bottom one dominates, but still, epis of a penetration there will be. Even the upper one is hot, so ad the mekarle, it will get cooled off. Tatah gavar, but up until that point, the efshar de libala purta, some of it will penetrate. So at least clip on me in the boya. And indeed, the Gemara says you're right, and we have to amend the Braisa. Elahema, this is Mama Shmuel, Tatah gavar. It's not going to fully penetrate. The bottom one will cool it off, but until it cools it off, some penetration happens, and then it's permitted. Then Madiach. Not only one, Braisa number 2. Tanya idach nacha Braisa. Basar reseach. Hot meat that falls into boiling hot milk. Just to clarify, boiling means we're going to go with the Hilchos Shabbos cooking Yatsi Ledis, which is really not that boiling, right? Let's go to 115 Fahrenheit. But anyways, if it's hot meat that falls into hot milk, and or v'chein soinen, cold meat that falls into hot milk. No, it's the ikir. What we are focusing on is the bottom item, tata'a, then asur. What does asur means? All of the milk, all of the milk, all of the meat, all of it, because it fully penetrated in the other. Again, just to repeat for the final time, if the ratio is 60-1, that's a whole different parsha. But no, you didn't have that ratio. Cham l'toich tzoinon, v'tzoinon l'toich tzoinon, madiach. Again, all you need to do is to rinse it off. So first of all, you see like Shmuel, but here the Gemara again is bothered. Even according to Shmuel, if it's cham l'toich tzoinon, even though tata gavar, but epis penetration there'll be. Fact the Gemara cham l'toich tzoinon madiach, and that's just rinse it off. But still, even the chamu epis ad the mekalei, by the time the bottom one taka dominated, but there was for a moment there was some heat. He efsher that the leibola put the meat absorbed something. So Enochanami, the Gemara says. Question. So klipa mi and liboya at least take off the peel. Elaima takachal l'toich tzoyna and koilef. Tzoyna l'toich tzoyna madiach. Yuvaldik. Speaking about bittul, just to share a story I heard from my Rabbi, from my Rosh Hashiva in Miami, that there was once a wedding that they were preparing. And then there was no refrigeration. A wedding means that you shechted an animal right before the wedding, and these are not people were not necessarily that wealthy. And as they're preparing the wedding, milk falls into the pot of milk, in pot of meat. And that was the end of the world. And they knew that there was no bittul b'shishim. And they really were in trouble. So the Rav called in the milkman, and they had a conversation, and the milkman left the office. The Rav went and he says that everyone can eat the meat. People were shocked. How can he say that? No one. And they asked him based on what? He didn't explain. Many years later, after the milkman passed away, the Rav on Shabbos says like this, that many years ago, there was the Shaila and people were criticizing me. I made an oath to the milkman that until his passing, I won't share, but now I'm going to share. What did he share? That he asked the milkman, how much water do you add to the milk? And he told the milkman, I won't tell anyone. And there was so much water in the milk that there was so little milk that little milk was like a bottle b'shishim. So just remember that. Now here in America, I don't know how much water is. I know that in Brazil, the milk never goes off. So my wife says, is that right? It's b'chalal milk. B'chalal milk. And you have to takano. So if there's a mixture, you have to find out before you throw away the meat. But let's come back over here. We learned. If it's cold and cold, then all you need to do is to rinse. Oh, nachadito. Guys, this is very important. We're learning Rashi, Gemara Rashi. Salt is not about absorbing. Salt is about transferring. Remember. So if the prohibited item was not salty, it was unable to shear, to transfer its isur into the heter. But if the asur item was salty, even cold, and according to many Rishonim, I don't care, top and bottom, does not negaya here. It can be any top, no matter what. The din will be asur, because Shmuel says, Meliach hareyu kiroiseach. Meliach transfers like heat. Another important detail that's not written in the Gemara, and this goes all the way in whoever learns smicha, that even though we paskin like this din, we paskin meliach kiroiseach, my friends, it only penetrates kedei klipa. That's what the Shach says. That's what we paskin. That's another detail. Another din of Shmuel, Rashi gives the example that if you have asur and heter, you have meat and milk, you have two items, and they were both soaking in a pot.
Hello.
They're both soaking in a pot. And Rashi says, of vinegar, so because of the sharpness of the vinegar, even though they're both cold, the taste of one penetrates the other. So says Rashi. Comes the Rosh. And the Rosh says, no, it doesn't only have to be vinegar. That even water, soaking in water, if you soaked it for 24 hours or more, that also has the koyach to transfer flavor. We paskin like the Rosh. Oh, that's very so neged to so many hilchas and kashus. Omar Rava says, Rabbi, that Hodam Shmuel Meliach, that Meliach has the koyach to transfer. That how salty, it has to be so salty that it becomes unpleasant to eat it. Not that you can't eat it at all, but it's already too salty. But if the item that's usher has salt and it's salty, but it doesn't make it unpleasant, then it no longer has any koyach to penetrate, and you apply the rules of tzayin and tzayin. And then comes a story that there was a young pigeon. The nafal akada the kamcha, it fell into kutach. Guys, we learned kutach is rotten milk with rotten meat, with a lot of rotten stuff, but they had a dip in Babylonia, and it was milchiks. And here a pigeon fell into a pot of kutach. Sharia rabchinana bereda rava or bereda rabba mi pashureina. He says you can have it. Oh, similar to the story I shared above. You can have it. And people, normally you would say, you're kidding? The pigeon fell into a milk dip? Yeah. So Rava says he was right because he was great. He knew the halach as well. Amar Rava, man chachem l'mishnah. Who had the wisdom to kasher it? Nilsa kiha. Must have been, and he got it right. It must have been Rav Chinona Bereda Rabba mi Pashureina, because Taka the Gavra Rabbahu. Now, people are going to say, what was the question? What was the pushback against him? That we paskin like Shmuel. Shmuel says that a salty item has the power to penetrate. Kutach is salty, so it penetrated into the pigeon. So that was the shocker that they had. But he explained, Amalach, no, that doesn't refute it in. Ki Omar Shmuel Malech Kereseach, like we just mentioned, that's only She'enu Nechal Machmas Milchay. Kutach, it was made as a dip. They didn't put so much salt to make it unpleasant. No, that's the way the dip was made. Hi, this kutach nechal machmas milchay, it doesn't have the din kiroi seyach. So in the case of tzoinen, and he says that you can eat it. Now another detail.
Were they able to take the pigeon out? Is it davar sheva minyan? You can just take the whole pigeon out.
No, they took it out. They took it out. The question was, can you eat the pigeon? Do we say that the milchiks of the kutach penetrated? Very good, very good. The whole sugi is not the end. It's only about the absorption of tam. Very important. Very good. Second to last line. And hanimili chai. Now, so many ways of learning. When do we say that you can eat the whole pigeon? The kutach is salty. That's not called salty. That's if the pigeon that fell in was raw. Then all you need to do is you need to rinse it off. But again, like we're learning. But avol tzli, but if it was already roasted, and by the way, it doesn't only mean roasting. We paskin in Shulchan Aruch, if it was cooked, it's already more absorbent. But how much more? It's cold and cold. It's not moliach. Then you need at least kedei klipa. Kedei klipa is enough, but you need something. You have to peel off the outer part. And another detail, and that klipa is enough. A very important detail. Ela de leis pile. There are no cracks in it. This is almost common sense. Abolis pile. If you have cracks in this pigeon, okay, kedei klipa, but the kutach went into the cracks. So then it's not going to be enough. And you know what? You can say the whole thing is usher. If it was cracked all the way through, then the whole thing becomes prohibited. The whole thing is kedei klipa. And now the final detail, if the meat was spiced, salt is about transference, not absorbance. Spice is about absorbing. If the meat was spicy, then all of it is usher, because spicy items absorb. Guys, we spoke just the Rashi Prakim, and Baruch Hashem, this is an area that many of us learn with many, many, many more details, but now we learn to source PESACHIM Dav Ayin Vav Amud Aleph. Now we're going to go to another general kashrus issue, Ayin Vav Amud Beis, like we spoke on in the intro. We're going to be learning the sugya of Reicha. Reicha is smell, Reicha means aroma, and the question is whether Reicha milsa or whether Reicha lav milsa. Let's read it inside. Amar Rav. Daf Ayin Vav Amud Beis. Daf Ayin Vav Amud Beis. Basar shechuta. If you have kosher meat, even, add the words, even if it's shamein, even if it is very fatty meats give off a lot more aroma, and it was roasted at the same time, with basar that's not kosher, for example, nevela. Even if the basar nevela is kachush, it's lean, so you can argue it gives off very little aroma. Rav, who's the one that says reicha milsihi, that aroma is a factor, it's something that we have to reckon with. Asur. Well, hold on. You can argue that the nevela doesn't even have an aroma to give off. Not true. Explains Rav. My tama. Because, like Rashi goes into details, the fatness and the aroma of the basar shchuta first goes into the nevela. Now, who cares? I'll tell you who cares. Now the nevela has in it some fat. some aroma, and it got mingled. And now that aroma goes out of the nevela and it goes back into the shchuta. That's the pshat. Mefat mei hadode. They fatten each other. We're not focusing on the nevela going into the shchuta. We don't need each other. The nevela is not kosher anyway. We need the from each other in the case where the nevela is kachush. So you would argue it's not giving off an aroma. It first absorbs and then it transfers. Levi says the opposite. Levi Omar, afilu basar shchuta kachush. Even if the kosher meat, Bechlal doesn't have that much fat. Shetzaloyim basar nevela shamein. So here it's like the worst. The one-way direction, at least initially, which is when it's the most potent, is it's going from the fatty meat into the non-fatty meat. Here, the nevela was the fatty one. If you would say that aroma is a factor, then everything would be not kosher. Says Levi Mutter, you are allowed to eat the kosher meat. It was roasted together. No double wrapping, no single wrapping, garnished. My tama, because reicha ba'almohu. Tam ke'isr, fine. Reicha, according to Levi, is nothing. The reicha lav mills, it's a non-factor. It's a non-issue. Well, not only did they argue in theory, but if more strong, many times there were arguments, but then one with the poil mamish, he would be machmer like the other. Not over here. Ovid, Levi, Uvda, Bei Reish Galusa, that in the house of the Reish Galusa, there were, he was the wealthy king of the Jewish people. He had many servants. Some of them were not Jewish. They are allowed to eat not kosher. And it happened to be that in the household of the Reish Galusa, they roasted at the same time a goat and a davar acher, Rashi says, a chazer, and a mamish, a pig. Pigs are fatty. And they asked Levi, can we eat the goat? You have to just appreciate this. Because over here, they were very wealthy. Sometimes, when it comes to rabbinic prohibitions, not biblical ones, we take into account, is there a lot of monetary loss? Can the person afford it? It doesn't have sit meruba. Here he said you can eat it. Oh, there was no Isur D'Oraisa, there's no Isur D'Rabbanan. He says, there he paskin that you can eat the gedi. This kasha is going to be against Levi. It says in a Baraisa, you're not allowed to roast two psachim together because of them being mingled. Now, what are we talking about? There's two ways of understanding it. So the premise, the kasha, is based on the understanding, my love, that we're speaking about ta'aroivas ta'amim, that the flavors, reicha milsi, the flavor of one penetrates the other. And who cares? I'll tell you who cares. You can only eat a Pesach on which you were pre-registered. If you are not pre-registered on it, you may not benefit. You can't eat it. If reicha milsi, so the tam of my other chaverim's groups, that flavor, that reyach went into mine, I can't eat it. That l'choyr is the meaning. So there is a taroivas tamim. Reicha, yes, milsi. The kasha levi answers the Gemara, no. The pshat over there is that mepein taroivas gufen. We are afraid that if you roast two carbon pesachs in the same oven at the same time, that each group will take out the other animal. They're gonna mingle the carcass. They're gonna mingle the pesach itself. Reicha is not a problem. And actually, the Gemara says, that must be the pshat in this braisa, because that you may not even roast together a gedi and a taleh. A carbon pesach can be a kid, it can be a lamb. You may not even do that. Now, what's the chiddush? Why would that be different? That the issue is because you might end up mingling the animal itself. Here is where you might have thought, guys, a lamb and a goat is not the same. So you would have thought that we don't have to have a fear that you're going to mingle it. Now, Taka, and why Taka may you not do it? I'll tell you why. Because these animals, they were not roasted when they were skin. There was no skin on them. Yeah, and they're already roasted. And not everyone can discern the difference between a lamb and a goat. But there's a novelty, because you might have argued that that's permitted. But which is what Rav would subscribe to, then who cares if it's a gedi and a gedi, or a gedi and a taleh, or a gedi and a gedi? Same issue. It has to be menuyav. And if your tam goes into my lamb, I can't eat it, because that taste is not something that I was pre-registered for. Now it's amazing. Not only will this now not be a question against Levi, now it flips. Now this taka will be a kasha against Rav. So the only issue is tareivas gufen. Who does it? Abel tarevis tamen, which implies that the mingling of taste is a non-issue. So l'chayra lema to have it to yufta the Rav. Answers the Gemara. No, that this brayso must be referring to another case as well, and that is that you roasted it in two separate pots in the same oven, but in two separate pots. The Gemara right away corrects itself. What are you talking about? Pesach, ketzat soilin on a spit, no pots. Yeah, that's what he meant. Which means that if you have an oven, but you pile the coals all the way, the whole vertical, you make a vertical wall of coals in the oven. So here you made it into two ovens. That is what we're saying, that you may not roast it together, even b'shtei kedeiros. In other words, if it's in the same oven, it's because there's a mingling. And what does Rav understand? That's the mingling. The first white line, my taroiv is common. Because reicha milsi, reicha is a factor. Then Rav adds another detail. And even if you're going to make a halachic barrier, which will disallow the mingling of taste, here also was it. Why? Because you might forget, is your Pesach in the right compartment, is your in the left compartment, and you might mix the bodies themselves. And on that, we add even Gediv, which on one hand are not exactly the same, but they are similar enough after being skinned and roasted that we are afraid that we're going to confuse one with the other. So it's not a kasha.
But not because the tastes are mingled.
Not because in the case where you have a barrier and everything. Now, Omar Rav Mari. Lechuura, the machloikas Rav and Levi is really a machloikas of Tanoim. And we're quoting a Mishnah here in Masechta Terumos. And the Mishnah writes, Haroy the Pascham, if a person removes hot bread from an oven, but it's still hot, and unasana, and you place it al pi chavya shel yain shel truma on the top of the opening of a barrel, of the mouth of a pitcher, of a jug of wine of truma. Rav Meir says oiser, meaning that you may not, a kohen may not consume the bread because the aroma of the wine penetrated the bread. Rabbi Yehuda says there is no such penetration. Here it's again reicha milsa or not. Rabbi Yossi differentiates matar b'shal chitim, that it depends what the bread was made out of. If it was made out of grains of wheat, then it does not absorb the reach, the aroma of the wine. Because physically so'idim shoy avois, barley bread absorbs more nekuda. So l'chayda my laftanoi. The Mar Savad, this goes on Rabbi Yehuda, right? That it absorbs. You may not. Rabbi Yehuda matir. If it's matir, it does not absorb. Reicha lav milsi. Umar Savad Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi in the case of barley that reicha yes milsi. So the Gemara says like this. According to Levi, vadai tanoi. He has no way out. Look inside Rashi. Levi the Omar reicha lav milsi. Vada milsi can only follow one side of this machlekes, right? Because according to Rabbi Meir, of course, reicha milsi. Rabbi Meir says oiser. Not only that, adds Rashi, even though Rabbi Yossi limits it to barley, but Rabbi Yossi asers, which means Levi will need to side with Rabbi Yehuda. He'll be moida. Question is, lerav nema tanoyehi, or will Rav have a way to explain that always reicha yes milsi? But he'll explain why Rabbi Yehuda is matir, and he does. However, did you not learn the discussion of Amoraim on this Mishnah and Terumos, which is that Mishnah is only referring to like Amar Rabba Bar Bar Chana Maresh Lakish. Bepas Chama, if the bread is hot, and Takaroida, you took it out of the oven, and the Chavis Psucha, and the barrel is opened because of Rav's. And according to him, all of the Tanoim's opinion that the reicha yes milsihi divrei hakol, because it absorbs the aroma. Aroma is a factor. On the other hand, if the bread is cold and the chavias megufa, it's closed. Now, guys, these stoppers, these corks were made out of earthenware, so there's a certain amount of pores. It's porous, but so what? But it's covered. Divrei hakol muter. Reicha can be milsa, but say it's cold and say it's covered, there's a mechitza, then in this case, there won't be any absorption. One of the two. Either the bread was hot, even though the barrel is sealed, again, it's not a plastic seal, but it's a material that's porous, or the bread is taka cold, but the barrel is opened, that over here, Rav Meir holds that the bread will absorb, at kedei kach, and here is what Rabbi Yehuda says, that it doesn't. And v'hanami, coming back to their machlekes, was about the Korban Pesach, right? So by kashrus, basar shchuta with basar nevela. In this case, it's kepas chama v'chavis pesuch yadam. They're both in the oven. They're both hot. Rav says that, again, even if the basar shchuta is the shamein and the basar nevela is the kachush, even here, it's usher because the aroma goes into one, then it goes back into the other. Tana, Rav Kahana b'reid Rav Chinana Sava. He quoted the following brayso: Pas sha'afa'a im tzali b'tanur. Let's move on. You have bread, and the bread was baked while in that oven you had meat roasting. Now that we are going to follow the shita of Rav, that reicha milsa, it means that the bread itself becomes fleishiks. So therefore, asur la'achla b'kutcha. You may not eat it with kutach. Reicha milsa. Next, hahi binisa, there was a fish, the itva that was roasted by hadi bisra, it was roasted in an oven at the same time that there was meat. So let's follow reicha milsahi, so the fish now becomes fleishiks. So the same thing, asra rabba mi parzikia, to eat it together with kutach, as we just learned in Amad Aleph, that kutach is milchiks. Fleishiks cannot be eaten with milchiks. Midrabana. You're not cooking it together, but you can't eat it midrabana. Now, hold on. Take a step back. Aside of milchiks and fleishiks, there's another issue. If we are saying reicha milsahi, when you cook a fish in an oven at the same time that has in it a roasting piece of meat, if the tam of the meat goes into fish, we have an issue not to have fish and meat. Oh, so Marba Ravashi says, hold on, you're right. But don't only say that you can't have it together with meat. Well, I'm sorry, with kutach. You can't have it with milchiks. Afila b'milchanami asura. You can't have the fish itself. He adds salt because people would salt the fish. Forget about eating it with milchiks. You can't eat the fish itself even just with salt. Mishum, because there is a danger of having fish and meat. And yes, I know that there are some who opine based on the Tosfos that says that neshtanu hativim, that there are certain natural phenomena that changed from when the times Chazal made their statements until nowadays. Nevertheless, once something was legislated, once something becomes usher, even if nishtanu hativim, we don't change. We don't have fish and meat together. Now, the type of separation is nowhere near the separation we create between meat and milk and a chanami. But nevertheless, we don't have it on the same utensil. We're going to eat something between. We're going to drink something in between. He said, and why? Because if you have fish and meat, two things can happen. Number one, kashya l'reicha, it can create in the person bad odor. And number two, which is a lot more severe, ula davar acher, on the same amid, on the top davar acher, meant chazid. Here davar acher means that a person, God forbid, can develop some sort of leprosy. Now, what's amazing from this whole sugya is that when we're speaking about the reicha, milsa, rav, or levi, reicha, lav, milsa, we're speaking about two items baked at the same time. The question will be, and this is more common today, what happens if it was not baked in an oven at the same time, but you have yourself a fleishika oven, and when you made your pizza, you put it accidentally in the fleishika oven, or vice versa, not at the same time. What will be the status of that food item? So just to be aware, that's called zeya. Zeya literally means perspiration. Zeya means a certain remnant of the original item on a lesser degree than aroma. And here also there is a debate. There are some, just to be aware, that are machmir, and they say that if it is a ben yoimai, which means that if meat was made today in this oven, which is within the 24 hours, then even zeya lechatchila will create a problem. Just to know, even the most chamor opinion won't be machmir in b'poel mamish if it's an einoi ben yoimai, because then we say noisem tam of gam. But if it's a ben yomer, here we have this big machlokes in halacha, and many, the lenient ones, say that our whole sugya, which is the source, the Gemara, is only speaking about at the same time. Masha'inkin, if it's not the same time, even if reicha milsa, zeya lav milsa. That's the big discussion we have over here. With this, we conclude, at least for this moment, for today's shiur, Hilchas Kashrus, and now we're going to come back to Korban Pesach. Now, Korban Pesach, even though it's not your typical communal carbon, A typical communal carbon means a sacrifice that one animal is brought for the whole congregation. The Talmud is one in the morning, another one in the afternoon for everyone. Korban Pesach is taka not brought everyone. I cannot eat up a whole animal, but it was many korbanos were brought because nothing was allowed to be left over. So you needed to make sure you have enough registrars, enough people that are able to consume it all. Fine. But there were many animals, it's still considered a carbon sibur because of the rule we learned before that any carbon that is brought bikinufia, that's the word in the Rishonim, it's brought in the assemblage because as we learned, pack 3 groups, but many people packed up, even though there were subgroups, it's called a communal carbon. And communal carbonis, if the majority have tumas, mace, or as we learned, tumas sheretz, not tumas zov, we had it not that long ago, then it's doiche tuma. However, says our Mishnah, chamisha devarim here means sacrifices, 5 sacrifices. Kake, they are bo'in betuma, if roiv tzibur tame, they would go through with the avoida, but there is a limit, there's a consequence, and that is the einam nechalim betuma. The main avoida, the zrikas adam, is done. The burning of the emurim is done. But if that has a part that's normally consumed, it may not be consumed. And now the Mishnah will give the 5 cases. Number 1, the omer. So the omer that's brought from the barley that grew in Israel. And if we learned in Menachos, we ideally went to the locations that produces the greatest quality of barley grains. And we took a omer. That's the whole omer. That's the source of how much, when exactly does challah have to be removed nowadays, even though only midrabanan, right? The amount of 43.2 eggs, with all of the debates, exactly what is that, right? 2.5 pounds to 5 pounds. Bekitzer, you took an amount of an omer. And when they prepared it in the Beis HaMikdash, guys, they only burnt on the altar a kemitza, that unique kemitza, the fistful in which you only use the index finger, the middle finger, and the ring finger. Remember that? And then you would use your thumb to make sure nothing is coming out of the index finger. You would use your pinky to make sure nothing is coming out of the ring finger. That was burnt on the Mizbech. And the rest is called shirayim. The shirayim normally is consumed by the kohanim. If roiv tzibur is tamei, the omer is brought, but the shirayim may not be consumed. Shtei halechem are the 2 chametz dika loaves that were offered on the holiday of Shavuos. And even though there were 2 times in the Beis HaMikdash that chametz was there, b'chlal, here, shtei halechem. The other one was the 10 loaves from the 40 loaves of the individual carbon toida. Never was chametz put on the altar. But the shtei halechem was part of the carbon. So how is it part of the carbon if it's b'chlal not being put on the mizbeach? Because we connected these 2 loaves with the 2 lambs that are called communal shlamims, that are brought on Shavuos. Remember that whole sugya? You put one bread on one lamb, you put another bread on the other lamb, and then you made the waving. The waving was done with both of them together. Then you shechted the lambs. The lambs were offered on the Mizbeach, and the Shtei Halechem was divided amongst the Kahanim. All of it. Oh, so if the Avodah is being done betuma, so you do the waving of the 2 breads, but it may not be eaten. Third case, Lechem Apanim. Every week, they put on new 12 Lechem Apanim breads. They took off the old ones. The Levina, the 2 spoons of the frankincense was burnt on the Mizbeach. That was the matir. The Lechem Apanim was then divided by both of the Mishmaros, Hanachnasis v'Hayotzes. I think we're going to learn this in Yuma, aside of us learning it way back in Kachim. And over here, again, if there is Tuma, then the Levina is offered, but these breads may not be consumed. Case number 4 is V'zivchei Shalmei Tzibur, which we just spoke about, which came along with the Shtei Halechem. It's interesting that it's called communal shlamim. Rashi writes the only communal shlamim was the 2 lambs that came on Shavuos together with the Shtei Halechem. Here also they are offered, they're not eaten. And the 5th that the Mishnah mentions is Seirei Rosh Chodashim. Every Rosh Chodesh we brought a he-goat as a chatos. And normally chatos is eaten by the Kahanim. Yes, if Roiv Tzibur is Tama, you bring it, but the meat is not eaten. Now, whenever meat is not eaten, so then there were certain locations where it was burnt. Now, are these the only 5 cases where a tzibur, carbon tzibur is brought to Tuma? No, we're going to learn in the Gemara, but these are the 5 categories. And contrasting, says our Mishnah, HaPesach, it has one up. Not only Shabbat B'Tuma, whether it is Reif Tzibur, whether it is Reif Kahanim, whether it is Reif Kalim, but on top of that, Nechol B'Tuma. Wow. We actually eat it as well. And why do we differentiate? Guys, what does it say in boy? Ish lefi ochloi tochaisu alaseh. Now, we also learned not that long ago that there are those who opine that if you did not eat it, it's good as well. Even according to that opinion, it should be eaten. It's primarily brought for it to be eaten. So since we know from the Torah that it's doicha tuma by a Pesach means we eat it as well. Let's begin with the Gemara. Says the Gemara, why did the Mishnah have to write the number? Right? Chamisha devarim. If the Mishnah just would have gone straight that ha'omer and shtei alechem and v'chulei, that they are bo'in betuma, but ve'enon ne'echolim betuma, you would count and you would know there are 5. Right? Many times the Gemara uses the expression minyan lamali. We know how to count. Chamisha lama'utemai. What are we trying to exclude? Because like we mentioned, even though the Mishnah gives 5 categories, it's not an exhaustive list. There are other karbanos tzibur that also are brought betuma, but not eaten. But if the Mishnah wouldn't have added the superfluous 5, I would have erroneously included chagigas chamisha asar. And like Rashi writes, we're not only speaking about Pesach. Since we're learning Masechtas PESACHIM, so the Gemara gives chagigas chamisha asar. This is really referring to every carbon chagiga that is brought by individuals ideally on the first day of Yontif. Here again, we're going to call this a carbon sibur, even though it wasn't one for all, because every Yid needed to bring an oilas re'iyah and a shalmei chagiga, and any carbon type that's brought bikenufia is considered a carbon sibur. The Salkadai Techamina, right, the second line under the Gemara, that kiven the carbon siburu, because again, the asya bichenufia and vikvia leimoyed, it should be brought on the first day of Yontif. If we're speaking about Pesach, which we are on the 15th of Nisan. So you would think here also titrei tuma. That's why the Mishnah writes, no, chamisha, not this chagiga. Kamash Malan, Kiven the islay tashlumin kol shiva, even though ideally you should bring it on the first day of Yontif. But if one did not, you can compensate for it during the remaining days of Yontif. So it's not the type of kivia leimoyed like the ones mentioned, right? The oimer has to be brought on the 16th, no compensation, etc. That goes to all the other cases. That's why, number 1, loidachia Shabbos. We're going to learn this God willing in tomorrow's daf, and daf ayin zayin, the b'moy adoi. So the b'moy adoi, even on Shabbos, b'moy adoi, even on Tuma. Whenever it's not a essential moyadoi, it's only a lechatchila dika moyadoi, then it's not doicha Shabbos. Umi the Shabbos loidachia is also loidachia Tuma. Frek the Gemara, let's hop another few lines. Another category in the Mishnah. Why are you writing 5? And we're not excluding Seirei Haragolim. Means that every Rosh Chodesh, a Musaf, the Musaf of Yontif. I know the Mishnah spoke about the Rosh Chodesh, but the Higo that's brought on every Yontif is also a Chatos, and it's eaten by the Kahanim, and it fits the Mishnah that if Roif Tzibaros Tamei, it's brought, but the Kahanim don't eat it. Answers the Gemara, no, the Mishnah didn't have to write Seirei Haragolim because the Mishnah wrote Zivchei Shalmei Tzibur, and it's mamish the same. It's both animal karbanos, or Belashon Chazal, it's blood karbanos. So the Mishnah, it's already included. Yeah, it's already included. Frek the Gemara, the last line, Ihachi, how is the he-goat that's brought on a Rosh Chodesh, how is that not included? Nami lo nitnei, that should also not be written because the Hatani Zivchei Shalmei Tzibur, right? Answers the Gemara, Amri, they answer the following. Daf ayin zayin, Seirei Rosh Chodashim was needed. And we just quoted the bimoy adoi, a carbon that is included in the moyed, that we know overrides Tuma. Now, is Rosh Chodesh called the moyed? Salkadai techamina, holiksiv moyed. You don't have, regarding Rosh Chodesh, a standalone word moyed. Now, you do have something very important. We're going to learn now the Tosfos, the second Tosfos. Even though, says Tosfos, and in Parshas Pinchas, it says also concerning Rosh Chodesh, that ve'elu tasu b'moy adeichem. This is what you should do in your special designated days. Now, the b'moy adeichem comes at the end of the Torah going through many different Yomim Tovim, including, we read it every Rosh Chodesh, Parshas Rosh Chodesh. So there is a moy adechem. It's more generic, but it should also include Rosh Chodesh. Says Tosfos Nisht, that if not for what we're going to learn in the next couple of lines, one might have said that the words B'moi Adechem written at the end of Parshas Pinchas does not refer to Rosh Chodesh. It refers to everything else, to all the other Yomim Tovim, but not to Rosh Chodesh. And therefore, we might have thought that there is no Moyed written regarding Rosh Chodesh, and therefore it should not be Doicha Tuma at all. Let's read it to Tzad Kamash Malon, that Rosh Chodesh is called a Moyed. But again, how do you know that? Again, you can touch the B'moi Adechem in Pinchas, not for Rosh Chodesh. I'll tell you how. Like Abaye taught us. That Tammuz, the Hai Shata Maluya. That Tammuz, in the year that we left Egypt, which is the year right prior to the sin of the spies, that Tammuz, unlike most years, that Tammuz is a month that only has 29 days, that Tammuz had 30 days. And let me just speak out by heart what we're talking about. Chevra, we know that the spies were sent out, and it says explicitly that they were there for 40 days. And when they returned, they came back with a bad report. And the night after they returned was the night that we cried. And for that, God says that you're crying a bechia shel chinam, that this will be the day that forever until Mashiach's coming will be designated as a bechia l'doiras Tisha B'Av. Now, make a cheshbon. We know, no one debates that. Moshe Rabbeinu sent the spies on the 29th of Sivan. Count the calendar. You're going to see that if Tammuz would have, like it normally only has 29 days, 40 days from the 29th of Sivan is the 9th of Av, which is a problem. Because if they came back on the 9th of Av, then the night after their return, which was the night that everyone cried, would have been the 10th of Av. But Tisha B'Av is Tisha B'Av. So Abaye explains, no. That year, the Tammuz didn't have the normal 29 days. Tammuz had another day. Once you add another day, so then the 40 days from the 29th of Sivan, Taka ends on the 8th of Menachem Av, Pungut. And they cried that night. And Abaye, now, what does that have to do with our topic? Oh, because it says in Echot Kara Olai Moyed that God says, I proclaimed a appointed time against me. Lishbar Bachurai, where the young men of the Jewish people got crushed. And that Moyed al Pi Pshat, we know, what does Moyed refer to the Pshat? We all know that. Tisha B'Av. Why don't we say Tachnun on Tisha B'Av? Because it's called the Moyed. That's the verse. But Abaye would darshan. Drush. Moyed goes on Tisha B'Av. Moyed goes on Rosh Chodesh. God says in order for it to fit that the day that they came was the 8th of Av, for them to cry on the 9th of Av, God says, Kara Olai Moyed, I proclaimed another day Rosh Chodesh. Not one day Rosh Chodesh, Tammuz 29 days. And then Menachem Av, then it was Av, had one day. No, that there was a 30th day to Tammuz. The 30th day nowadays is also Rosh Chodesh. That's the drush of Korah. So from the Pasik in Eicha, where Megale, Gavaldik, put it with the Tosfos, so since you have an Eicha Moyed, the drush referring to Rosh Chodesh, so when it says in Pinchas Eila Tasu B'Mayadechem, the Mayadechem goes to everything written in the Parsha, including Rosh Chodesh. Rosh Chodesh, the Mishnah had to say, it's called a Moyed. A Moyed is Doicha Tuma. Taka Eina Cholam B'Tuma, but yes, they are brought B'Tuma, Gavaldik, God willing, to be continued. Yep. That's good.
Two Paschal lambs not permitted because of the aroma that goes between them at all.
For two reasons, Baruch. Number one, according to Rav, because of the aroma, and according to Rav and according to Levi, is because when you roast two things together, there's a fear that the wrong group will take out the wrong group.
Okay, I thought that. And the second thing is top to bottom, bottom to top. When a hot drop falls on a cold earthenware and then spritzes back, the top now is the cold drip, the bottom then is the meat. Is that right?
So let's go. There's three steps. The hot fell on the cold. According to Rav, the hot made the cold hot. So now the earthenware is hot. Once hot and hot, even the bottom dominates. Once hot and hot. So now the earthenware makes the gravy a little bit hot. So now the gravy is not only fire roasted, then it's hot and hot. Then when it goes back hot and hot, it goes in again.
But the meat at that point is the bottom.
The meat in that time is irrelevant. It's hot and hot, irrelevant. You're making a very important point because there's a whole question how to define the top. You're right that when you're speaking about hot and bottom, when you smear the oil, it doesn't matter where the oil went. That's a good point. The top doesn't have to mean what you think is top, but it's irrelevant here because it's hot and hot.
I understand.